welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into the darkest corners of medieval history to uncover the serial killers you've never heard of. These aren't the famous names like Vlad the Impaler or Elizabeth Bathory that everyone knows. These are the forgotten monsters whose stories have been buried by time, but whose crimes were just as chilling. Now, you might be wondering, did serial killers even exist in medieval times? The answer is absolutely yes, and in some ways, the Middle Ages were the perfect hunting ground for these predators. Think about it, no forensic science, no DNA testing, no fingerprinting, no police force as we know it today, no mass communication to warn neighboring towns about dangerous individuals, and perhaps most importantly, no real understanding of mental illness or criminal psychology. In medieval Europe, unexplained deaths were often attributed to divine punishment, demonic possession, or witchcraft. This meant that serial killers could operate for years, even decades, before anyone realized they were dealing with a human monster rather than supernatural forces. The legal system was also vastly different. Justice was often swift and brutal, but it was also inconsistent. A wealthy noble could literally get away with murder, while a peasant might be executed on suspicion alone. This created a perfect storm where certain individuals could kill repeatedly without consequence. What's even more chilling is that we only know about the cases that were documented. Remember, literacy rates were extremely low, and record-keeping was inconsistent at best. For every medieval serial killer we know about, there were likely dozens more whose crimes were never recorded or whose records have been lost to time. So let's begin our journey into this dark chapter of human history. Our first case takes us to 14th century France, where a seemingly respectable citizen was living a double life that would make even modern serial killers seem tame by comparison. Our first killer operated in the shadows of medieval Paris during the late 1300s, a time when the city was already reeling from the Black Death and the Hundred Years' War. But even in those dark times, the series of murders that began in 1387 stood out for their calculated brutality. The man we know only as the Paris Strangler, in surviving court documents was actually a distant cousin of the famous knight Jean de Courrèges, yes, the same man whose story was recently told in the movie, The Last Duel, but while his famous relative was fighting for honor on battlefields, our killer was stalking the narrow streets of Paris for very different prey. What made him different? Well, unlike the random violence that was common in medieval cities, these murders showed clear patterns that we would recognize today as the work of a serial killer. The victims were always young women, always found in the same general area of the city, and always killed in the same manner, strangulation with a leather cord. But here's what makes this case particularly fascinating: the killer kept trophies. This is something we associate with modern serial killers, but medieval records show that investigators found a collection of jewelry, hair ribbons, and personal items belonging to the victims hidden in the killer's home. The investigation into these murders gives us a rare glimpse into medieval detective work. The Prévôt of Paris, essentially the city's chief law enforcement officer, actually employed what we would recognize today as criminal profiling. He noted the similarities between the crimes and theorized that they were the work of a single individual. This was revolutionary thinking for the 14th century. Most officials of the time would have attributed such deaths to separate incidents, bad luck, or divine punishment. But the Prévôt was ahead of his time, and his methodical approach eventually led to the killer's capture. Court records reveal that our Paris Strangler came from minor nobility, which explains how he avoided suspicion for so long. He was educated, well-dressed, and moved in respectable circles. By day, he worked as a clerk for a wealthy merchant. By night, he prowled the streets looking for victims. What's particularly chilling is that he specifically targeted women who reminded him of a childhood traumatic experience. According to his confession, obtained under torture, so we must take it with a grain of salt, he had been humiliated by a group of young women when he was a teenager, and his murders were his way of evening the score. The killer's downfall came when he made a crucial mistake. He attempted to murder a young woman named Marguerite, but she survived and was able to describe her attacker. More importantly, she had scratched his face during the struggle, leaving visible marks that several witnesses noticed. When investigators connected these fresh wounds to the leather cord evidence and witness testimonies, they had enough to make an arrest. The killer confessed under torture and was executed by hanging in 1389, but not before revealing details about several other murders that had been attributed to accidents or unknown causes. So why isn't this case famous? Simple. The records were nearly lost in a fire that destroyed much of the Paris court archives in the 15th century. Only fragments survived, and most historians focused on the more politically significant cases of the time. It wasn't until the 1960s that a French historian pieced together the full story from scattered documents. This case shows us that serial killing is not a modern phenomenon. The psychology and patterns were the same 600 years ago. The only difference was the tools available to catch them. But our next case takes us even further back in time, to 12th century England, where a monk's vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience hid one of the most disturbing killing sprees in medieval history. Monasteries in medieval times were supposed to be places of sanctuary, healing, and spiritual refuge. The Hospitaller order, in particular, was known for their care of the sick and dying. So when Brother Thomas joined the monastery of St. Bartholomew in Yorkshire around 1150, no one suspected that death would follow him wherever he went. But over the course of nearly 2 decades, Brother Thomas would become one of history's most prolific healthcare serial killers, operating centuries before anyone had even conceived of such a thing. Brother Thomas had what modern criminologists would call the perfect cover. As a member of the Hospitaller order, he was expected to be around the sick and dying. Death was a constant presence in medieval monasteries. People came there as a last resort when all other medicine had failed. What made Thomas particularly dangerous was his knowledge of herbs and poisons. Medieval monks were often the most educated people in their communities, and many were skilled in what passed for medicine at the time. Thomas had taken this knowledge and twisted it for his own dark purposes. The first sign that something was wrong came from an unlikely source: the monastery's financial records. Brother Thomas was in charge of recording the personal belongings of patients who died in their care, and a sharp-eyed abbot noticed some disturbing patterns. Wealthy patients seemed to die much more quickly than poor ones. Patients who arrived with valuable jewelry or coins rarely lived more than a few days, while poor peasants might linger for weeks. Even more suspicious, certain valuable items that should have been in the monastery's care had mysteriously disappeared. What followed was one of the most thorough investigations of the medieval period. The abbot, rather than immediately accusing Brother Thomas, decided to conduct what we would now recognize as a statistical analysis of the monastery's death rates. He compared the mortality rates during Thomas's shifts with those of other brothers. He tracked which patients died and how quickly. He even exhumed several bodies to look for signs of poisoning, something almost unheard of in the 12th century. Based on surviving records, Brother Thomas likely killed between 30 and 40 people over his 18-year career at the monastery. His victims ranged from wealthy merchants seeking treatment for various ailments to noble ladies who came to the monastery for rest and spiritual healing. His method was typically poison. He had access to various herbs and compounds, and his medical knowledge allowed him to administer doses that would appear to be natural deaths from illness. He particularly favored a combination of foxglove and nightshade that would cause heart failure in patients who were already weakened by illness. What made Brother Thomas particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective was his motivation. Unlike many serial killers who are driven by sexual gratification or a need for control, Thomas seemed primarily motivated by greed, but with a twisted sense of religious justification. In his eventual confession, he claimed that he was helping to speed the souls of the wealthy to judgment because their attachment to worldly goods was preventing them from achieving salvation. He saw himself as performing a kind of spiritual service, while simultaneously enriching the monastery, and himself, through theft. Brother Thomas's downfall came when he made the mistake of targeting the wrong victim. In 1168, Lady Eleanor of Northumberland came to the monastery seeking treatment for a persistent cough. She was wealthy, traveling with an impressive collection of jewelry and gold, making her an attractive target. But Lady Eleanor was also the sister of a powerful baron who had connections to the royal court. When she died suddenly after only 3 days at the monastery, her brother demanded a thorough investigation. The trial of Brother Thomas was unprecedented in medieval England. For the first time, what we would now recognize as forensic evidence was presented in court. The exhumed bodies of several victims showed signs of poison. Financial records demonstrated the correlation between wealthy patients and quick deaths. Even primitive toxicology tests were conducted on remaining tissue samples. The trial lasted for 3 months and drew observers from across England. The Catholic Church was particularly interested in the case because it raised serious questions about the trustworthiness of religious institutions. Brother Thomas was found guilty and sentenced to death, but here's where the story takes an interesting turn. The Church, fearing damage to its reputation, tried to suppress the details of the case. Thomas was quietly executed in 1169, and most of the trial records were sealed. For centuries, the story existed only in fragments, a mention here in a royal chronicle, a reference there in a church document. It wasn't until the 1800s that historians began to piece together the full scope of Thomas's crimes. This case had a lasting impact on how monasteries operated. New rules were implemented requiring multiple monks to be present during patient care. Financial records became more detailed and were subject to regular audits. The Hospitaller Order, in particular, instituted new protocols for handling patient belongings. What's striking about Brother Thomas is how closely his case parallels modern healthcare serial killers like Harold Shipman or Charles Cullen. The same patterns are there: the targeting of vulnerable patients, the use of medical knowledge to kill, the theft of valuables, and the exploitation of trust. It shows us that the psychology of serial killing has remained remarkably consistent across centuries. The tools and opportunities may change, but the fundamental drives and behaviors remain the same. Our next case takes us to a very different setting, the bustling trade routes of medieval Germany, where a seemingly helpful innkeeper was making travelers disappear in ways that would make even modern horror movies seem tame. The Black Forest of medieval Germany was already a place of legends and dark folklore, but in the early 13th century, it became home to one of history's most calculating serial killers. Along the busy trade route between Frankfurt and Basel stood an inn that promised weary travelers food, shelter, and safety. Instead, it became their tomb. The man we know only as Heinrich the Host ran what appeared to be a prosperous roadside inn. But beneath the floorboards of his establishment lay the remains of dozens of merchants, pilgrims, and travelers who had made the fatal mistake of stopping for the night. Heinrich's inn was positioned at an ideal spot for a serial killer, isolated enough that screams wouldn't be heard, but busy enough to provide a steady stream of victims. The Black Forest was known for its dangers: wolves, bandits, and treacherous paths, so when travelers disappeared, it was easy to assume they had fallen victim to the wilderness. The inn sat at a crossroads where two major trade routes intersected: merchants carrying valuable goods, pilgrims with their life savings, and nobles traveling between cities all passed through Heinrich's doors. And many of them were never seen again. Heinrich's killing method was sophisticated for its time and showed clear premeditation. He would study his guests carefully during the evening meal, identifying those who traveled alone and carried valuable goods. He paid particular attention to their conversations, learning about their routes, their destinations, and whether anyone was expecting them. Late at night, after his victims had retired to their rooms, Heinrich would slip a powerful sleeping draught into their wine or ale. Once they were unconscious, he would smother them with a pillow, a method that left few obvious signs of violence and could easily be attributed to natural death if the body was ever discovered. What makes Heinrich's case particularly chilling is the sophisticated system he developed for disposing of bodies. Beneath his inn, he had constructed an elaborate network of tunnels and chambers that connected to a nearby underground stream. Bodies were first stripped of all valuables, then dismembered to make them easier to handle. The remains were then fed into the stream, which carried them deep into the forest where they would likely never be discovered. Any clothing or personal items that couldn't be sold were burned in a special furnace he had built for this purpose. Heinrich wasn't just a serial killer, he was running what amounted to a medieval criminal enterprise. The valuables stolen from his victims were sold through a network of contacts in various cities. He had partnerships with dishonest merchants who would buy jewelry, coins, and luxury goods with no questions asked. He also sold the horses and wagons of his victims, often altering them enough to disguise their origin. Some historians estimate that Heinrich's criminal activities made him one of the wealthiest men in the region, though his wealth was carefully hidden. Based on items found when Heinrich's inn was finally investigated, experts believe he killed between 50 and 70 people over a period of about 15 years. His victims included silk merchants traveling from Italy, wool traders from Flanders, pilgrims heading to or returning from Santiago de Compostela, minor nobles and their retinues, scholars traveling between universities, artisans carrying valuable tools and finished goods. What's particularly tragic is that many of these people were probably at the height of medieval prosperity, successful merchants and craftspeople who had worked their entire lives to accumulate wealth, only to have it stolen along with their lives. Heinrich's downfall began with a coincidence that he couldn't have predicted. In 1231, a merchant named Otto of Cologne was traveling to Basel with a valuable shipment of goods. He stopped at Heinrich's inn but became suspicious when he recognized a piece of jewelry being worn by Heinrich's wife, jewelry that had belonged to Otto's brother, who had disappeared while traveling the same route 2 years earlier. Instead of confronting Heinrich directly, Otto pretended to continue on his journey but actually circled back and began watching the inn from the forest. What he witnessed over the next several days horrified him. Otto returned to Frankfurt and reported his suspicions to the local authorities. But rather than simply raiding the inn, they decided to set up an elaborate trap. An undercover investigator, posing as a wealthy merchant, stayed at the inn while being secretly watched by armed guards hidden in the forest. Sure enough, Heinrich attempted to drug and kill the fake merchant. The guards burst in just as Heinrich was attempting to smother his intended victim, catching him literally red-handed. When authorities searched Heinrich's inn, they made discoveries that shocked even hardened medieval investigators. The tunnel system beneath the building contained dozens of skeletons in various states of decay. Hidden chambers held thousands of coins, jewelry, weapons, and other valuables stolen from victims. Perhaps most chilling of all was Heinrich's record-keeping. He had maintained detailed logs of his victims, noting their names, when he could determine them, their wealth, and the methods he had used to kill them. This level of organization was almost unheard of in medieval crime. Heinrich's trial became one of the most notorious legal proceedings of the 13th century. Representatives from across the Holy Roman Empire attended, both to witness justice being served and to identify items that might have belonged to their missing citizens. The scale of Heinrich's crimes was so shocking that special laws had to be written to address them. He was ultimately sentenced to be torn apart by horses, one of the most brutal execution methods available, but even this was considered insufficient punishment for his crimes. After Heinrich's execution, his inn was completely destroyed and the ground was consecrated by the church to try to cleanse it of evil. For generations afterward, travelers avoided the area, and it became known as Heinrich's Hollow, a name that persisted well into the Renaissance. The case also led to changes in how inns were regulated along major trade routes. New laws required innkeepers to register their guests with local authorities and to account for any travelers who failed to continue their journeys. But if you think Heinrich's crimes were shocking, wait until you hear about our next case. We're traveling to 15th century Italy, where a respected physician was using his medical knowledge to conduct experiments on living human beings that would make even the most notorious modern serial killers seem tame by comparison. Venice in the 15th century was at the height of its power and influence. It was a city of incredible wealth, art, and learning, a place where the Renaissance was beginning to bloom. But in the narrow canals and shadowy alleys of this magnificent city, one of history's most disturbing serial killers was conducting his own twisted version of scientific research. Dr. Marcello Ferrante was a respected physician and scholar, educated at the University of Padua and well-regarded among Venice's elite. But behind his respectable facade, he was conducting horrific experiments on living human beings, experiments that went far beyond anything we would recognize as medicine, even by medieval standards. What made Dr. Ferrante different from our previous cases was his motivation. While Heinrich the innkeeper killed for money and brother Thomas for a twisted sense of religious duty, Ferrante claimed to kill in the name of scientific advancement. He saw his victims not as people, but as specimens for his research into human anatomy and physiology. This was during the early Renaissance, when there was a renewed interest in scientific inquiry and human anatomy. However, the Church still severely restricted medical research, particularly dissection of human bodies. Ferrante used this restriction as justification for his crimes, claiming that he was advancing human knowledge in ways that conventional medicine could not. Ferrante specifically targeted Venice's most vulnerable populations, beggars, prostitutes, orphans, and foreigners who wouldn't be missed if they disappeared. He operated what appeared to be a charity clinic, offering free medical care to those who couldn't afford treatment elsewhere. But once patients entered his clinic, many never left. Ferrante would perform increasingly invasive treatments on his victims, ostensibly to cure their ailments but actually to satisfy his curiosity about human anatomy and physiology. Based on journals that were discovered after his capture, Dr. Ferrante conducted what can only be described as medieval human experimentation. He performed live dissections to study the function of various organs. He tested the effects of different poisons and drugs on the human body. He even conducted primitive brain surgery to see how different parts of the brain controlled different functions. What makes this particularly horrifying is that Ferrante kept detailed scientific records of his experiments. He approached torture and murder with the same methodical precision that legitimate scientists used for their research. He measured, recorded, and analyzed every aspect of his victims' suffering and death. Ferrante's medical credentials provided him with perfect cover for his crimes. When people died in his clinic, it was assumed they had succumbed to their illnesses or injuries. The fact that he was treating the city's poorest residents meant that few people investigated when his patients disappeared. He also had connections throughout Venice's medical community, which helped deflect suspicion. Other doctors respected his apparent dedication to treating the poor, and his scholarly writings on anatomy and medicine were well regarded by his peers. Ferrante's crimes might never have been discovered if not for a stroke of bad luck. In 1463, he treated a young woman named Isabella, who was the daughter of a minor noble family. She had been living on the streets after being disowned by her family, but she had managed to get word to a cousin about her location before seeking treatment at Ferrante's clinic. When Isabella disappeared, her cousin investigated and discovered that several other people had recently vanished after visiting the doctor's clinic. This was enough to prompt an official investigation. When Venetian authorities raided Ferrante's clinic, they found a chamber of horrors that shocked even experienced investigators. The basement had been converted into what amounted to a medieval laboratory, complete with surgical tables, specimen jars, and detailed anatomical drawings based on his illegal dissections. They also found Ferrante's journals, which contained meticulous records of his experiments on living human beings. The level of detail was both scientifically impressive and morally reprehensible. He had documented every aspect of his victim's suffering with the cold precision of a scholar. During his interrogation, Ferrante showed no remorse for his crimes. Instead, he argued that his work was advancing human knowledge in ways that would ultimately benefit all of mankind. He claimed that the Church's restrictions on anatomical research were holding back medical progress and that his methods, while extreme, were necessary for scientific advancement. This defense was remarkably similar to arguments that would later be made by Nazi doctors and other medical war criminals. It shows that the corruption of medical ethics for supposedly scientific purposes is not a modern phenomenon. Ferrante's trial was unprecedented in Venetian legal history. The authorities struggled with how to prosecute crimes that had no clear precedent in medieval law. How do you charge someone for conducting unauthorized medical experiments? How do you classify torture that was supposedly done for scientific purposes? Ultimately, Ferrante was charged with multiple counts of murder, but the trial also raised broader questions about the ethics of medical research and the limits of scientific inquiry. These were questions that wouldn't be formally addressed until centuries later with the development of modern medical ethics. Dr. Ferrante was executed by drowning in the Venetian lagoon, a fitting end for someone who had drowned his victims in their own blood and suffering. But his case had lasting impacts on how medical practice was regulated in Venice and other Italian city-states. The Venetian authorities, fearing damage to the city's reputation as a center of learning and culture, attempted to suppress the details of Ferrante's crimes. His journals were supposed to be destroyed, but some were secretly preserved by scholars who recognized their historical significance, despite their horrific contents. For centuries, Ferrante's case existed only as rumors and fragments. It wasn't until the 19th century that historians began to piece together the full scope of his crimes from surviving documents and architectural evidence at his former clinic. Our final case takes us to the very end of the medieval period, where the changing times created the perfect opportunity for one last forgotten monster to prey upon society's most vulnerable members. Our final case brings us to London in the late 15th century, during the transition from medieval to early modern England. This was a time of great social upheaval. The Wars of the Roses had ended, trade was expanding, and cities were growing rapidly. But with this growth came new problems, including large numbers of homeless children living on the streets. Into this chaos stepped a man we know only as Master William, who presented himself as a charitable soul dedicated to helping London's orphaned and abandoned children. But behind this benevolent facade lurked one of history's most disturbing predators. To understand this case, we need to understand the social conditions of late 15th century London. The city was experiencing rapid growth, but there were no social services as we know them today. Orphan children, particularly those from poor families, were left to fend for themselves on the streets. These children survived by begging, stealing, and doing whatever odd jobs they could find. They slept in doorways, under bridges, or in abandoned buildings. They were completely invisible to respectable society, perfect victims for someone with evil intentions. Master William operated what appeared to be a charitable organization dedicated to helping street children. He would approach homeless children with offers of food, shelter, and work. He presented himself as a pious Christian doing God's work by caring for society's most vulnerable members. He had established what he called houses of refuge in several locations around London, buildings where he claimed to house, feed, and train homeless children in useful trades. To the outside world, this appeared to be exactly the kind of charitable work that the church encouraged. But the reality inside Master William's houses of refuge was horrific. Rather than helping children, he was exploiting them in every possible way. Some were forced into hard labor under brutal conditions. Others were sold to unscrupulous employers who treated them little better than slaves. And the youngest and most vulnerable children simply disappeared. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that Master William wasn't just a serial killer, he was running what amounted to a medieval human trafficking operation. He was simultaneously exploiting children for labor, selling them for sexual abuse, and murdering those who became inconvenient or tried to escape. Because these children came from the very bottom of medieval society, we know very little about most of Master William's victims. They had no families to report them missing, no official records of their existence, and no one in authority who cared about their welfare. Based on the investigation that eventually brought Master William down, authorities estimated that he had been responsible for the deaths of at least 30 children over a period of about 8 years. But the true number was probably much higher, possibly over 100 victims. Like Heinrich the innkeeper, Master William was essentially running a criminal enterprise. He made money from several sources: selling children to employers who wanted cheap labor, procuring children for wealthy clients who wanted to abuse them, and stealing any possessions the children might have had when they came to him. He also received donations from wealthy Londoners who thought they were supporting charitable work. This gave him both funding for his operation and a veneer of respectability that helped deflect suspicion. Master William's downfall began when he made the mistake of targeting the wrong child. In 1487, he approached a boy named Thomas, who appeared to be a homeless orphan but was actually the illegitimate son of a minor court official. When Thomas disappeared, his father used his connections to launch an investigation. This was probably the first time in Master William's career that anyone with power and influence cared about one of his victims. When authorities raided Master William's primary house of refuge, they found conditions that shocked even hardened medieval investigators. Children were chained in cellars, living in their own filth and showing signs of severe malnutrition and abuse. They also found evidence of the murders: shallow graves in the building's courtyard, bloodstains that had been hastily covered up, and personal items belonging to children who had supposedly been placed in good homes, but had actually been killed. Several surviving children were able to testify about Master William's crimes, though their testimony was complicated by the legal status of children in medieval England. Child witnesses were generally not considered reliable, and children from the lower classes had even less credibility. However, the physical evidence was overwhelming, and some of the surviving children were able to provide details about specific murders that convinced investigators of Master William's guilt. Master William's trial was notable for being one of the first cases where crimes against children were treated as seriously as crimes against adults. This represented a significant shift in medieval legal thinking about the value and rights of children. He was ultimately executed by hanging in 1488, but not before confessing to numerous crimes against children. His execution was public and drew large crowds, showing that his crimes had shocked London society. Master William's case is important because it shows us how serial killers adapt to the social conditions of their time. He exploited the gaps in medieval society's safety net to prey on victims who had no protection and no voice. His case also demonstrates that the sexual exploitation and murder of children is not a modern phenomenon. The same predatory behaviors that we see today existed in medieval times, though they took different forms based on the social structures of the era. As we reach the end of our dark journey through medieval history, it's worth reflecting on what these cases tell us about human nature, society, and the persistent problem of serial killing throughout history. Despite the centuries that separate these cases, and the very different social contexts in which they occurred, we can see some striking similarities. All of these killers exploited positions of trust and authority. Brother Thomas used his religious position, Dr. Ferrante his medical credentials, Heinrich his role as a host, and Master William his charitable facade. This shows us that serial killers have always understood the importance of appearing respectable and trustworthy. They all targeted vulnerable populations, people who were unlikely to be missed or whose disappearances could be easily explained away. This demonstrates a calculating intelligence that contradicts the popular image of serial killers as disorganized madmen. These cases prove that serial killing is not a product of modern society, mass media, or contemporary stresses. The psychological drives that create serial killers have existed throughout human history. What changes are the opportunities, methods, and tools available to both killers and those who pursue them. The medieval period actually provided some advantages to serial killers that modern killers don't have: no forensic science, limited communication between communities, and social systems that made certain people effectively invisible. But it also had some disadvantages: smaller communities where strangers stood out, and swift, brutal justice when killers were caught.